My uncle raised our rent for the third time in 14 months, blaming a management company he swore he had no control over. 11 days later, a business registration search told me exactly whose signature was on that company's paperwork. This is still Waters. Here's what she wrote. I'm Bianca, 31. 4 years ago, my uncle Gerald offered my husband and me a 2-bedroom unit in a fourplex he'd inherited from my grandmother. Family rate, he called it, $200 below market, a favor between blood. We took it gratefully, the way you take a gift from someone who raised half the price, specifically because you're family, and not because he had to. For the first year, it genuinely was a favor. Rent stayed flat. Gerald fixed the water heater himself. It felt like the arrangement it was supposed to be. Gerald had always positioned himself as the responsible one in his generation of the family. The sibling who'd stayed close to home, who'd shown up for every hospital visit during my grandmother's final year, who'd taken on the burden of managing her estate so nobody else had to deal with probate paperwork and property transfers. That reputation wasn't undeserved, which is part of why none of us questioned him closely when the fourplex passed to him alone instead of being split among the cousins, the way some of the rest of her modest estate was. He'd earned a certain benefit of the doubt, and for years he used it exactly the way you'd hope someone would, generously, quietly, without ever making anyone feel like they owed him for it. That changed about 2 years in, right around when Gerald hired a management company to handle the building. Larkspur Holdings, he said, professionals who'd take the hassle off his plate now that he owned 2 more properties across town. Our rent went up $150 that year. Larkspur sent a form letter, generic, corporate-looking, citing market adjustments. Gerald, at Thanksgiving that same month, told the table he'd fought Larkspur hard to keep our increase as low as possible, that they'd wanted more, that he'd used his relationship with the property manager to protect us. I believed him. My husband, Wes, believed him less, but Wes doesn't believe anyone's story on the first telling, which used to annoy me, and now I understand a lot better. There are 2 other units in that fourplex, both rented to people outside the family. A retired teacher named Odalis in the ground floor unit, and a young couple, the Pharaohs, above her. I didn't think much about their leases at the time, beyond a vague, comfortable assumption that Gerald probably charged them a bit more than us, since we were the ones getting the family discount. That assumption turned out to matter more than I realized months later. What made the whole arrangement feel sustainable, at least for a while, was how normal Gerald made it seem. He'd show up unannounced sometimes on a Sunday with a 6-pack, fix something in the unit that didn't strictly need fixing, stay for dinner, tell stories about my grandmother. It didn't feel like a landlord-tenant relationship. It felt like family helping family, which is exactly why the rent increases, when they started, felt less like business decisions and more like small betrayals dressed up as bad luck he was suffering through on our behalf. The second increase came 8 months after the first. Another $175, another Larkspur letter, another Thanksgiving speech about how hard Gerald had pushed back on our behalf. That second increase landed the same month Wes and I were trying to save for a down payment on our own place eventually, and the extra $325 a month combined on top of everything else was the difference between hitting our monthly savings target and falling quietly short of it, month after month, in a way that never showed up as one dramatic setback, just a slow erosion of a number we were both watching. By the third increase, this January, $190, bringing us to within $40 of what units in comparable buildings across the street were actually renting for. buildings with no family discount to begin with. Wes said something at dinner that I couldn't stop turning over afterward. Doesn't it seem strange that Gerald's protecting us from a company that keeps raising our rent by almost exactly what a normal landlord would? I told him he was being unfair, that Larkspur managed properties for other owners too, that the market was genuinely tightening across the whole city, that Gerald had shown me comparable listings once to prove he wasn't the problem. Wes didn't push it further that night. He just said, quietly, that comparable listings are easy to find when you're the one setting the comparison. I loved my uncle, and I still do, even after everything. I didn't go looking for a conspiracy. What actually happened is that my cousin Priya, Gerald's daughter, not mine, so there's a family layer to this that matters, mentioned offhand at a birthday party that her dad had been buried in paperwork lately, setting up the new LLC for the properties. I asked, just making conversation, if that was Larkspur. She said no. Larkspur was the older one. This was a second entity, something with holdings in the name for the 2 new buildings he'd bought. That sentence sat wrong with me for reasons I couldn't name that night. 2 days later, on my lunch break, I pulled up our state's business registration search. Public record, free, takes about 4 minutes, and typed in Larkspur Holdings. The registered agent was a law firm, unhelpful on its own, but the annual report, also public, listed the managing member, Gerald Voss, my uncle. Not professionals he'd hired, him. I sat in my car in the office parking lot for a long time after that. I pulled every rent increase notice we'd received going back to when Larkspur first appeared and lined them up against the dates Gerald had made his "I fought hard for you" speeches at family dinners. Every single increase had come from a company he owned outright, submitted through a law firm's registered address, specifically so it would read as arm's length and impersonal. Then he'd shown up to Thanksgiving and taken credit for limiting damage he'd fully authorized himself. I checked one more thing before I said anything to anyone. Our state has a rent notification law. Nothing dramatic, just a requirement that landlords disclose common ownership between a property and any management entity handling it, specifically so tenants aren't misled into thinking a third party is negotiating on their behalf. Every Larkspur letter we'd received had a line at the bottom, small print, Larkspur Holdings is an independent property management company. That line was false. I had the registration document proving it. Once I had that, I did something I almost talked myself out of. I knocked on Odalis's door downstairs, told her I was reviewing my own lease for an unrelated reason, and asked, carefully, if she minded sharing what she was currently paying and whether she'd ever met anyone from Larkspur in person. She hadn't. Her rent had gone up twice in the same period ours had, by percentages almost identical to ours, despite us supposedly getting a discounted family rate underneath all of it. The Pharaohs told me something similar the next evening. None of them had ever spoken to a Larkspur employee who wasn't, on closer inspection, Gerald himself using a slightly different voicemail greeting. Odalis mentioned something else, almost as an aside, that stuck with me longer than the rent numbers did. She said Gerald had personally called her about 8 months earlier to apologize for the increase, telling her he'd argued with the new management company on her behalf and gotten them to keep it lower than they'd originally proposed. Word for word, nearly, the same performance he'd given us at Thanksgiving. He wasn't just managing the numbers quietly behind a corporate name. He was actively building goodwill with every tenant in the building by playing the reluctant messenger for decisions he alone was making, collecting gratitude from 4 separate households for damage he was the sole author of. I spent an evening after that going back through 4 years of my own calendar, trying to count how many times Gerald had brought up Larkspur in conversation, framing it as an outside force he was managing rather than a business he owned. The number was higher than I expected. Family barbecues, a phone call the week of my wedding when he'd mentioned dealing with Larkspur stuff as an excuse for seeming distracted, a passing comment at my grandmother's grave on the anniversary of her death. The lie wasn't a single decision. It was a habit he'd built into nearly every corner of how he talked about his own life. I didn't confront Gerald at a family dinner. I went to see him alone on a Tuesday evening at his actual house with the printed registration document in a folder. I told him I knew Larkspur was his, and I asked him one question: why he'd told us for 2 years that he was fighting on our behalf against a company that was, on paper, entirely him. He didn't deny it. Not really. He said the LLC structure was for liability protection, standard stuff. My accountant set it up, which might even be true as a separate fact, but didn't touch the actual question. When I pressed on the specific dinner table speeches, the ones where he described negotiating with Larkspur, pushing back on numbers, he got quiet and then said something that told me more than any explanation could have. I didn't think you'd mind paying market rate eventually. Everyone else in the family pays market rate for what I've built. Everyone else in the family didn't grow up eating dinner at that kitchen table 3 nights a week after my mom, his sister, died when I was 19. I didn't say that part out loud. I didn't need to. He knew. Gerald tried a second explanation after the first one landed badly, that raising rent through Larkspur rather than directly kept things professional, easier for everyone, less awkward than him personally telling his niece her rent was going up. I asked him how performing a fight on our behalf against himself qualified as less awkward than simply being honest about the number in the first place. He didn't have an answer for that one. He looked, for the first time since I'd sat down, like a man who understood the conversation had already been lost several sentences earlier and was only now catching up to it. What I did instead was calmer than I expected to be capable of. I told him the disclosure line on every Larkspur letter was false under the state notification law, that I had 4 years of documentation, and that I wasn't interested in a lawsuit against my own uncle. I was interested in an honest number going forward, with the ownership disclosed the way the law actually required. I also told him, plainly, that Odalis and the Pharaohs had noticed the same pattern independently, without any prompting from me, which meant this wasn't a story only I was in a position to tell if it came to that. I gave Gerald a week to respond before I involved anyone else in the family, mostly out of respect for what he'd genuinely done for us over the years, even knowing what I now knew about the last two. He spent that week trying a few different angles with me directly, first minimizing, then explaining the liability protection logic again in more detail, once even suggesting that Wes had probably put me up to making a thing of this, which was its own small insult I chose not to dignify with much of a response. None of it moved the actual facts, which was the point of having them documented in the first place, rather than relying on how a conversation happened to go. Gerald didn't fight me on the legal point, because there wasn't a version of that fight he could win once the registration document existed in writing. What he fought me on, quietly, over the following 2 weeks, was the idea that he'd done anything wrong at all. Texting Wes, not me, to say he felt ambushed, that family shouldn't need paperwork between them. I let Priya know what I'd found, not to turn her against her father, but because I didn't want to be the only person in the family holding this. She wasn't entirely surprised, which told me something too. She said Gerald had mentioned once, in passing, that he structured things so the numbers made sense, and she'd assumed that meant taxes, not tenants. We settled on a rent freeze at the current number for 18 months, in writing, signed by Gerald personally, rather than through Larkspur's registered address, with an explicit disclosure clause added. Any future increase had to state plainly, in the letter itself, that Larkspur was wholly owned by Gerald Voss. He didn't love that clause. He signed it anyway, because the alternative was me filing the disclosure complaint I'd already drafted. O'Dallas and the Pharaohs got their own version of the same letter within the month, unprompted by anything I'd asked for directly. Gerald's accountant, it turned out, had recommended fixing the disclosure issue building-wide, rather than leaving two other households as a liability once one tenant had already caught it in writing. O'Dallas thanked me for it awkwardly in the hallway a few weeks later, not fully understanding why her rent letter suddenly read differently, and I didn't explain the whole story. Some of it wasn't mine to hand out. Thanksgiving this year was quieter. Gerald didn't give a speech about fighting for anyone. He asked, at one point, almost like he was testing the water, whether I was still upset. I told him I wasn't upset that he owned a management company. That's a smart, ordinary thing to do. I was upset that he'd spent 2 years describing himself as our advocate against a system he was quietly running, and that the difference between those two things was the entire point. My aunt, Gerald's wife, pulled me aside in the kitchen later that evening, drying dishes, and told me she hadn't known about Larkspur's ownership either. Not really. Gerald handled the business side, and she'd never had a reason to ask specifics. She wasn't defending him exactly, just telling me the family performance had apparently reached further than I'd assumed, further than even his own household. I believed her. It made the whole thing feel less like a scheme aimed specifically at me and more like a habit Gerald had built into how he explained himself to everyone, family included, whether or not there was actually anything to hide that year. Wes and I are still in the unit. Rent's fair now, disclosed correctly. No performance required at family dinners to make it feel like a gift. Priya and I are closer than we were, oddly, the two of us now checking each other's version of things instead of taking Gerald's dinner table account as the full story. Wes brought up gently, a few weeks after everything settled, that he'd noticed the pattern almost a year before I actually looked into it, and hadn't pushed harder because he didn't want to be the son-in-law accusing my own family of something he couldn't prove. I told him I understood that instinct, and that I wished he'd said it plainer anyway, because a year of extra rent increases is a real number, not an abstract one, even if the eventual outcome landed in roughly the same place. We've since agreed, in a much smaller and gentler way than the agreement I made with Gerald, that neither of us sits on a real suspicion about money for a year out of politeness again. I still love my uncle. I just don't need him to perform generosity anymore. The paperwork can just say what it says. And when he fixes something in the unit now, unprompted, on a random Sunday the way he always used to, I let myself enjoy it again for what it actually is. An uncle who's handy and doesn't mind helping, instead of quietly wondering what story might get told about it later at someone else's dinner table. Priya told me recently that she started asking Gerald more direct questions about the other properties he owns now. Not out of suspicion exactly, more out of a new habit of checking rather than assuming. He's answered everything plainly so far. I don't know if that's permanent change, or just him being more careful now that one niece has already caught the pattern once. Either way, the family group chat reads a little differently these days. A little more like people actually asking each other things, instead of everyone quietly trusting whichever version got told loudest at dinner. So here's what I keep wondering. How many of us have thanked someone for protecting us from a problem they were quietly profiting from the whole time? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.